Anybody who is a Protestant coming to that realization that the church that they're in cannot be identified historically back to the time of Christ, that puts you in an extremely insecure position. Jesus started his church. He said, I will build my church, not Martin Luther, not Thomas Cartwright, not some person 3/4 of the way towards our current point in history after 1,500 years. I came very clearly to realize that if I couldn't identify my church in the 1st century, in the 4th century, in the 8th century, in the 12th century, in the 16th century, and in the 20th century, it wasn't the church. Because Jesus' promise is serious, that he would build his church and the gates of hell would not prevail against it. So I tell anyone who's asking themselves the question today from a similar background, to look at the way that they're believing, the way that they're worshiping, the way that they're living, and ask themselves, can I find continuity between what I'm doing now in all the centuries leading back to Christ? Because you should be able to see that.
Why?
Unless Jesus is either weak or a liar, you have to find it, because he promised to build his church. He gave the church a commission to go into all the world to make disciples of all the nations. And that's what the church has been doing. The church will never be defeated by Satan. The vigilance that Jesus has shown historically to guard the integrity of his church is quite clear. If you look in the Revelation, the Apocalypse, right, the last book of the New Testament, it starts with this heavenly vision in which Jesus appears to John, his beloved, right, who put his head on his chest. They were like this. And John's now an old man on the island of Patmos when he receives the revelation, the Apocalypse. And Jesus gives him 7 letters to 7 local churches that John was overseeing in Asia Minor. This is just on the western part of Asia. Like you go to Constantinople, right, furthest eastern part of Europe, and they just go across the Bosphorus. And that's where the churches were. Every one of those churches, Jesus gave a message, and it went something like that. It has the same literary structure, all 7 letters. He says who he is, something about him that's very relevant to that church's condition at the moment. If they're doing anything really great, he tells them, hey, I'm so proud of you for this. If they're doing something wrong, which 5 of the 7 were, he says, you're making serious mistakes in this area. And then he tells them to fix it, to repent. And then he issues a threat. He says, if you don't, I'm going to do something. And the typical threat is, I'm going to blow your candlestick out. What that means is that the candlestick represents, from chapter 1, the churches, the light of Christ that they're bearing in the world. And if they weren't guarding it, if they weren't carrying the light into the darkness of the world, Jesus asked them to step up. And if they refused to step up, he says, you're going to disappear. And the gospel will go someplace else and you'll get replaced. And that's happened many times throughout church history. This shows also the vigilance that Jesus takes to maintain the purity and integrity of his church. He's not just a great watchmaker that made the church and now it's running by itself and he's over there. No, he's at the heart of the church. He's at the heart of every liturgy. His spirit is what is empowering us to serve him and to fulfill the mission of the church, which is to cover the whole world with the knowledge of God as the waters cover the sea. This is the prophetic vision, to literally make disciples of all the nations. And that vigilance Jesus has shown. He has inspired the church in every generation to go into the world. You should be able to recognize the church for 20 centuries. And certainly we can. Orthodox Christians are very serious about this. I remember one time I gave a sermon in my parish.